announcements related to the course. I know a few of you have had issues with the current issue, so I will take a look at that today and just see why the assignment isn't showing up correctly. But when you do access it, before you begin the test, it's not technically a test, but it's set up that way in Blackboard, you will have an article, a link to an article, and a link to a short video that discusses the disruptions happening in retail. So you'll need to read through those and watch those first before doing the assignment. You can do the assignment all the way up until the due date in mid-October, so you just definitely want to start thinking about doing that soon. In terms of any other assignments, I have now a stack, so I'll start grading those. And as I said, the first day of class, I'll be grading those sort of, at will, and I'll be posting them as we go. So if we are getting closer to a due date on an assignment, you don't see anything, just make sure you touch base with me to make sure that I had it and that you've been graded. All right, so I'm really excited about today. We have Gilles Montezin visiting with us today. Gilles has spoken in this class quite a few times now over the past 6 years, and it's always a pleasure to have him, not only because he has so much to say and such an interesting perspective on fashion, but also because he's a dear friend of mine, and it's always fun to talk. We can do that for hours and hours and hours. So just a little bit about Gilles. His background is that he was trained at l'École de la Haute Couture in Paris. He has worked for the houses of Lacroix and Azzaro. In fact, he was there at Christian Lacroix for 8 years. After that, he decided to move to New York City, where he set up his own label, and that included both made-to-measure and bridal. He's dressed a lot of celebrities, including Deborah Messing, Kim Cattrall, Sarah Jessica Parker. He provided clothes for Sex and the City, the movie, Ugly Betty, Confessions of a Shopaholic. He's been featured in Elle, the New York Times, WWD, among others, and most recently, some of his pieces were featured in the Lemonade Tour for Beyonce. So, welcome, Gilles. Come on up. Plus, I told him to wear these pants today. Aren't they great? They're Gautier, right?
Galliano.
Oh, Galliano.
Galliano.
Yeah.
Thank you, everybody.
All right, I'm going to turn on a slideshow as well that will go in the background, and we'll discuss it as we go through. Sound good? Okay. You are now.
Is it? Yeah. Okay, good.
You can't get lost in those pants. What collection is that?
Hand painted for Galliano. It was year 2008.
2008, all right. So before, I actually asked Gilles. Gilles has, for the last couple of years, has really, I've always had him start the series, this time not this time, but he's always talked about fashion history, particularly early 20th century fashion history related to Poiret and Chanel. And today I asked him to do something a little different, in large part because starting next week, we're going to be having guests who are working in fashion related to gender and how gender is changing and how we perceive gender and how that changes how we dress or how we design. Next week's guest will be the founder of Bindle and Keep, Daniel Friedman. And so today I thought, and we'll get there in a moment, but I wanted to talk to him a little bit about the history of clothing as in a gendered sort of way so that we have some foundation when we hear these speakers that come in the next few weeks. Sound good?
Sounds very good.
I know that's what you prepared, so that's good. So Gilles, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and sort of where you come from and sort of how you ended up in Paris in Haute Couture, working for Lacroix.
Okay. Well, I was born in the north of Canada, 400 miles north of Montreal. That's very, very, very cold. We used to have like snowstorm like that, and we say, oh, it's snowing today. And it's the third biggest copper mine in the world. I always was interested in fashion, so I moved to Montreal to get my degree in fashion design. There's not a big scene in Montreal for fashion, so after a while I was very bored and I decided to move to Paris because I'm also half French. My father was French, my mother was Canadian. So in Paris, I found an haute couture school, the official haute couture school that supplies all the people who work in the haute couture industry. Haute couture, by the way, it's a label. It's a trademark. No one outside of Paris, no one outside of the trade has the right to use the word haute couture officially. So I registered to the school, and I also was able to work at the Maison Lacroix, who was the biggest seller of all the Maison Haute Couture at that time. There's clients who would go there every season and they would buy 15 dresses, believe it or not. And the dresses are worth each one the price of a Lamborghini, you know. So I was very lucky to work on those dresses that are amazing. It's at the level of art at that level. So after a while, when I thought that I saw what I wanted to see and did what I wanted to do. That's a very PR way of putting it. It's a little bit more complex than that, but after a while when I decided that I had done my things in Paris, I looked at other possibilities, and New York sounded very, very interesting because it linked quality and performance, productivity, which was not present when I was in Paris. So when I first arrived here, I liked the energy, and I decided to create my own label. And I was picked up by Saks Fifth Avenue, and at that time also I had an agent who would send clothes to different celebrities and different production, TV production and movies and stuff like that. So I had a pretty good PR coverage with my clothing. So now I'm doing everything. I'm doing fashion, bridal, as you could see before, also costume design and different things like that. Everything that I can sew and everything that I can design, it's, you know, welcome.
So tell them a little bit about what your sort of areas of expertise are, the people that come to you for your expertise in the business.
Well, most of my clients, of course, it's a little bit less artistic than when I was working in Paris. But most of my clients are people, women who want made-to-measure, high-end made-to-measure clothing. At the opposite of the Paris clients, the American clients have events to attend. They come to me and they say, I have this and this and this event. Please don't do purple because I just wore it. Please don't do red because my friend's gonna wear red. And you know, it's got specifics. As of in Paris, they say, oh, I'm attending a charity, please dress me. And the specifics are much less
specific
and more artistic, if you would like. So that's my majority of my clients.
And on the screen beforehand, we had some pictures of your bridal collection. You want to explain a little bit how bridal came to be?
Bridal came to be because it's the closest to what haute couture would be in America, or at least the way that I treated it. It's the way that I treat it. It's more like haute couture. All the dresses are handmade. All the fabric treatment and manipulation is all handmade, and it's all hand applied on the dresses. So it's everything is very, very, very artisanal and craft compared to other designers that sketch a thing and give it to somebody else, and they never see the dress until it's on a rack somewhere. So I keep a very, very hands-on thing on the dresses all the time.
So a lot of what you do is your own label and your own work and your own clients, but you also work for other designers sort of behind the scenes. This is sort of the double life of a fashion designer here in New York City. Can you tell us a little bit about what that is, especially in the last few weeks with New York Fashion Week?
Okay. As I like to do all the things. I like to construct also the garments. I like to sew, and I like to be able to make them and do the fittings and everything. So I also work for different designers, depending on the season, depending on what they need. I'm gonna do their samples for their runway show, or their photo shoot, or their celebrity red carpet events. So I've done things for Zach Posen, Brandon Maxwell, the latest that I'm Marc Jacobs, thank you, and the latest a brand that is resurfacing, Adrian, who was a costume designer back in the 50s in Hollywood, and his last 15 years of life, he was a fashion designer. He sold at Neiman Marcus and different department store. So they are reviving the brand, and I was contributing with them, and it was very, very pleasant, actually. It was a very, very good quality of clothing and very, very appealing.
I think last time you were here, you had just finished a dress for Naomi Campbell in 24 hours. Is that true?
Naomi Campbell and also
Kerry Washington?
Kerry Washington for her awards, for her Oscars.
How do you turn a dress around in 24 hours for somebody like Naomi Campbell? This is what they really want to know.
I think you just don't have to think about all the mechanics of the thing, and you just have to do it, period. You have the fabric. I did not even have measurements, believe it or not. They told me, oh, she's about 5'11", and I'm like, about? And what size is she? Make her that size. And they pointed me to that mannequin. And I'm like, okay. So it turned out like very, very good. There was no alteration. And they brought it to her, Naomi Campbell in LA, and just like 2 hours before her appearance for the MTV Awards or something like that. And there was absolutely no alteration. So I was, very, very lucky. But it's also a question of perception. I've watched pictures of her online and tried to understand her body and try to understand her proportion. And I deciphered all of that information, and I just built the dress according to my perceptions, basically. So.
Before we move on, actually, this is usually I would move on to the next thing, but are there any questions about Gilles and sort of his background before we move on? Okay, yes.
How long did you study sewing
For
for couture?
couture, I did not take the whole program because I did not want to do the sketching and the history and different things that I already did when I was in Montreal. So I did mostly draping on a mannequin. The sewing, fortunately, I was paid to sew during the days. So I did not study for sewing. I studied for draping and making the patterns. And working at Maison Lacroix provided me for the lessons of sewing while I was paid.
You did a lot of costume shop work, right?
Yes.
In Montreal and Paris. So you had a lot of opportunity to sew everything.
Yes, yes.
Any other questions in regards? Yes.
I guess it's sort of related to how you started, but for the American student, do you think, what are the odds if you start off in sportswear to move into evening wear, dresses and everything? Because, as when you're young, you just take any opportunity that's around. But if you ideally want to work with fine fabrics and dresses and beautiful things, what are the odds of being able to move into that after working in, a sportswear setting?
Well, I guess the key to success is your own working all the way up to it. I did not have any luck. When I first arrived in Paris, I went to the library and I took all the books that I could find, all the names of costume designer, fashion designer, couture, and their phone number, and I called everybody. I called more than 200 people until I finally got a job. So there's no secret. The more you work, the more you put your name out there and your request out there, the more chances you're going to get to have positive answer to your request. So it's up to your work, basically.
So I think it's a good segue into our conversation today in the sense that, knowing Gilles for so long, he knows all of the ins and outs of the fashion industry and history and all the different detailings that were done at any given decade. And so much of it is just having that understanding. That's such a talent when you're going in and talking to people to be able to recognize those kinds of things, yes?
Yes, totally. I would say the main question that always comes to me is, what is your best advice for somebody who's starting? And I'm always give the same answer because I tell them get experience, because experience equals solution. The more you know what you're doing, the more you have options. If there's a problem, the more you're going to be able to apply a solution and find a solution to the problem. So experience is basically solution solving. That's what you're doing all the time. When you're working, you go, shoot, I don't have enough fabric. What can I do? Or, So if you have the experience, you can find solution or cry.
Or cry. So much of our modern day concept of haute couture is luxury and that sort of thing. But really, when you boil it down, couture is very much about traditional sewing methods and draping and pattern making methods. There's a lot of traditions that are related to couture. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Well, couture is from the beginning. Haute couture has been completely made up. It's a British guy that came to Paris and decided that he would cater to a very, very wealthy clientele, which were the courts of Europe. Every country of Europe at that time had king and queens and courts. So there was a lot of money to be made if you wanted to cater to them. So he created the concept of haute couture, which is basically a snob way of making clothes. So he made it up, all of that, by himself. And with time, the techniques have evolved and changed and progressed. And I think the heyday of couture was probably in the 90s and 200s, where the quality of the craftsmanship was out of this world. The first thing they teach you when you go to haute couture school is not to damage the fabric. And it's very, very important, because you're going to work with fabric that are probably the equivalent of cobweb. You look at them and you just fall to pieces. But you have to make a dress with that fabric, so you have to be able not to damage it. But the evolution of the techniques is endless. I remember, and this cannot get out of here, we glued a hem at Christian Lacroix at one point. But it was not possible to do anything else because it would have marked. If it would have sewn, even with hand sewing, it would have marked the fabric. So we decided to glue it, and it worked, and it was fantastic. So haute couture, even now, evolves into something else that was not there back in the 30s, 20s, and when it started.
Can you tell them about the dress that you had actually beheld and constructed?
Yeah, that's funny. There was a dress, of course, you have to finish the dress, and it looks like there's little fairies that hippity-dippity-pow, and the dress has appeared there, and nobody touched it, So you have to make a dress in a way that the effort doesn't show. There's no crease, there's no hand stains, there's nothing on the dress. So I had to, the dress was completely finished, except I had to go sew the lining around the waist. So somebody was holding the dress around me, and I plunged inside the dress to sew the waist at the lining at the waist. But I could not touch the table. I could not touch the table because the dress was overflowing. So somebody behind me was holding me like that. And I was basically floating on top of the table sewing, and it was just, that kind of thing that you don't see in shops where everybody eats their cookie on the table and have, paw prints on the fabric. It's far from there.
So let's jump into this idea of in particular of gender and how it relates to fashion. We spent a lot of time, you and I, talking about the turn of the century, 20th century, so the 1910s, Poiret and Chanel. So why don't we start there just for a moment and kind of set the stage, if you don't mind, and let's talk about Poiret and the beginning of La Garçon. And then let's go backwards and maybe sort of illuminate where this all started, shall we? Okay. So why don't we start with Poiret? Tell us a little bit about Poiret and his wife and sort of this change that was happening at the turn of the century.
Okay. Paul Poiret was a Parisian couturier. At that time, they had to be part of the Haute Couture Association in order to have a certain standing. Up until the 70s, you still had to be part of the Haute Couture Association. So he was a couturier in Paris in the early 1910s. He was an art head. He was very impulsive, and his parents wanted him to calm down and give him studies at a law school. He wouldn't like that, so he got engaged by a local tailor. And sooner, he started to draw dresses and coats and send it to different couturiers. He got paid. Certain couturier would buy the sketch, which you don't see that anymore. That's over. Sorry about that, but it doesn't work with that anymore. And he got hired by this company, this couturier, to design different pieces. And there's a coat he did, which is a very Chinese coat. It's called the Confucius coat. It's basically those bat wing coat that you see from the 20s. And they sold that coat to 600 copies. So it was an astounding success. And with that success, he started to open his own house. He says, I cannot do that for others, and I have to do that for myself. So he's opened his own house, he's opened his own workshop, and he had immediate success because he was a big believer of no corset. The corset was still going on very, very strongly in the 1910s. A little bit of Joan of Arc. And it was also a thing to do because the First World War was roaring, 1914, 1918, and they needed all the steel that they could get their hands on. So a corset basically has steel bones inside to push the fabric up and to keep it very, very straight and creaseless. So they abolished the corset. And he was a very big supporter of that. He created the empire waist, which is just the smaller part of the body is cinched right under the bust, which frees totally the waist, which the corset was cinching. So he had a tremendous success because he helped women to get free of the corset, and also he suggested a lot of different Oriental influences. He was a big traveler. He brought fabrics and tapestries from a different Orient country, Morocco, Algeria, and all those countries. And he made clothes with them. So it was never seen before because most of the time was little flower fabric with little lace, and it was very conventional and classic. So he completely shook that up and introduced a lot of novelties and a lot of things that women were very, very fond of.
His wife became sort of one of his muses in a way also, and she was very famous for being the original garçon, or the boy. Can you talk about that a little bit? Because oftentimes that's connected more to Gabrielle Chanel.
Yeah, that's Chanel basically inherited of what Poiret did, and she took it on her own as if she created it, but it's not true. Denise Poiret was his wife, and she was the first one in 1911, at least at the first picture that we can find from Denise with short hair was a picture from 1911. So she was ahead of her time with promoting a freer way for women to behave and to be. At that time, women would grow their hair as long as possible, never cut it, put it in a bun and this and that, and it was very demanding. And they had layers and layers and layers of petticoats under their skirts, and she dropped all of this, had one layer of fabric on top of her body, and that was it. So she promoted a lot of his fashion, because she also was that woman. And you can put anything on anybody, but if they don't feel it, if they don't carry it, it's not going to work. You're going to see that they're uncomfortable. But Denise was la garçonne, the first tomboyish, if you translate it that way, woman that came up in the 1911.
And then there was a book that was written a little later on called Le Garçon, right? Or that sort of described this woman, this new empowered woman who was more like a man than a woman. Yes.
Talking about.
And so talk about the influence that had on Chanel in the early 20s and how that sort of led to her adapting men's styles and men's fabrics and so on into her collection.
Exactly. There was this very, very famous author in France, Maurice, forgive me, I forgot his last name. He won the Legion of Honor, which is the equivalent of a Sir in English, for his body of work. He was a very, very successful author, and one of his books was La Garçonne, which means the tomboy, but also in his take, it means a girl who lives in a studio. And that, before that moment, it would never exist. A woman could not live alone. By themselves. They were not considered, sorry about that, but they were not considered maturely enough to be able to sustain themselves. That was the time. Huh? So he wrote that book about that girl who her fiancé cheated on her, and she lost it, and she broke him with him, and she went out, rented a room for herself, and found herself a job, and had sex with women and men independently, indifferently, and she smoked and she drank, and so it was very, very, very shocking for the people in France at that time. But it was like 10 years later, after Denise Poiret, and that is possibly what inspired Chanel to create the look that she did. Basically, the look that Chanel created was to wear and cut men's clothing. She was basically the lover of a rich man, and she was left alone in his castle. And what do you think she would do all day long? She would dress up with his clothes. So at night they would throw parties, and she would be dressed in his clothes, pants, cardigans, shirts, and all the attire. And she built up a reputation for herself as being a free woman. But it existed already 10 years ago, 10 years before with Denise Poiret.
So let's hold that thought there and let's go back. I know you have looked, and you're sharing some pictures here as well, but when were the original, because in effect, what Chanel did was take cross-dressing and turn it into a product that could be sold to women, and it was very connected to what was happening socially at that time. But let's go back. I know you have a few pictures up here that go back to the 1100s. When sort of, how did this gendered role or this externalization of gender start to appear, at least in Western civilization, and sort of what were some of the common themes up until the 20th century?
Well, this is a man, by the way, and it was a general
Military general?
No. He was the manager of New York and New Jersey. Sorry.
Oh, okay.
I forgot.
Governor.
Governor.
Yes.
There's a proof of there's evidence of cross-dressing all around the world and in different area of time. If you would take it like just in the Shakespeare area, just as a very broad example, everybody knows Shakespeare. He was in the 16th century, 17th century, and at that time, under the Elizabethan reign, there was women were not allowed to play in theater. Go figure for what reasons. All the reasons that you can think of, probably. And so it was the role of women were played by men on theater. But what happened is Shakespeare, out of his 38 body of work that we know by now, there was 8 that contain cross-dresser, mostly women to men, because they had to escape situation, danger, or lover that they don't want, or whatever. So you can imagine that. The man would play the women, and the women is a cross-dresser in the play. So it's like, the man plays a woman and he has to play a man in the play. So it was like, why make it simple when we can make it complicated? It was a little bit the same in kabuki. The kabuki was originated as an all-female theater troupe that would play vaudeville. It was dance, singing, and play. They presented it in front of the emperor. He liked it. And since it had a very big success, other troupes started to produce similar plays. And they evolved the genre as what we know now. But after a while, the emperor did not like the fact that women were on stage because after work, they were offering their services to their patron in exchange of money. Of course, sexual services. So they were prostitutes. So the emperor did not like that. So he declared that women should not play in theater. So they created all-male troupe for kabuki. So they created a young male playing female roles because they had the voice higher pitched and they could imitate women's behavior easier than adult men. That did not solve the problem, sorry, because the young guys did exactly the same thing as what women did. They prostitute themselves. So the emperor changed again the rules and he makes like an all-man adult crew. And this is what we know now. This is what came to tradition. Kabuki is traditionally made by an all-male crew.
You were talking about corsets earlier, and part of the couture tradition is really also the layering that's involved in many cases, especially early couture. But in many ways, what the people would wear was a shell sort of underneath, and then the clothing would be made to go on top of that shell. How did that relate in terms of the men wearing women's clothes? I mean, in a sense, they were creating the ideal shape of a woman. It didn't really matter who was sort of underneath it. Is that?
Well, women who wore a corset through all the history, probably for 400 years, they were trained since age 12 to start wearing corsets. So the whole bone structure was trained and molded to adapt to a corset. You cannot do that with a man, and you cannot do that with anybody who wants to wear a corset overnight. You can cinch probably, with these days, with a woman figure now these days, you can probably cinch 2-3 inches at the waist without being painfully uncomfortable. So you can attain a certain female silhouette, but not more than that. So I suppose they went on and compensate with makeup and hair and behavior. And
was there any connection in terms of cross-dressing in terms of the corset? I know men in the 1800s, particularly mid-1800s, also wore corsets for a time. It was in fashion. Was that related in any way, or is that just sort of the fashion at the time for men to also be thin-waisted?
I think it was fashion at the time with Beau Brummel, who was very popular back then to lead fashion for male. What happened is during the French Revolution, France was not anymore a leader in fashion because all sorts of new fashion were sprouting, and it was not necessarily very pleasing for the rest of Europe. And since France had a civil war, nobody was really interested in copying anything that would come from France. So the men's fashion was shifted to England, where they were dandies starting to wear very fancy horse riding outfits, and they developed what we know now as the suit, but it evolved from there. And probably people like Beau Brummel, who was a very prominent dandy at the time, was very fond of extreme. He wore his cravat until his neck was higher than a normal position, and other extremes like that. And he wore a corset, and probably that contributed to the popularity of wearing corsets in 1820s, 1830s in Europe.
So in terms of historically, before the 20th century, what were some of the key You mentioned Beau Brummel, who is very famous for being very feminine in the way that he styled his clothing. He was called a dandy. Oscar Wilde, obviously, around the same time. But what were some notable, if any, sort of this idea of switching women's wear to men's wear, these transfers of styles from women to men before the 20th century?
I think it's an individual, if it's not promoted by either social things like rules, like women cannot appear on stage and different things like that. If it's not promoted by that, every, let's call them cross-dressing, every cross-dressers were individuals who wanted to experience freedom of dressing like they want, and in this case, cross-dressing. So there are a little bit of documents about them, but not that much. It's not very well documented.
And what about, I mean, if I think back to the court of Louis XIV and then further with Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, just prior to the French Revolution, you know, if you look at a man back then, they were wearing silk stockings, long hair, makeup, high heels. So when did this sort of shift, this idea of femininity that we see today in the 21st century, when did that shift take place? Was that with the French Revolution, or?
I would say probably with Marie Antoinette, you would see fashion until more or less the reign of Marie Antoinette. Men were always the more flamboyant, the more decorated and everything. A little bit like in nature, unfortunately, it's not a question of sexism. It's, you know, just how it is. In nature, the male, let's say birds, because it's more obvious than in any other animal, are always the one that has the more colorful feathers, or the longest, or the more, you know, display of colors. So men were always the ones who were the more colorful and flamboyant in fashion until more or less Marie Antoinette, who was the first one, by the way, to be known as to have a fashion designer helping her to dress. Before that, it is very, very little known if there were anybody who really influenced fashion, as of fashion going forward by itself, more or less. But with Marie Antoinette, we know that she had a helper that helped her with doing this only.
That was Rose Bertin?
That was Rose Bertin.
And we have books of her fabrics and designs, don't we, that have been found?
Yes, they found all of it, her ledgers with notes, handwritten notes, and little swatches of fabric of everything that she done for Marie Antoinette, and copies of those books are available now. It's priceless.
So obviously the Victorian era was very gendered in general in terms of the male and female body. Women were meant to be very idealistic in their shape. Charles Frederick Worth, who you mentioned earlier, was very much about the bustle and the very elongated shape. When did that start to shift? And because you mentioned Poiret sort of in the teens, in the 20th century, when did that shift happen, that women started to sort of divest themselves of all these layers and idealized shapes that led to essentially that look, the garçon, the tomboy look?
Mm-hmm. I would say probably when Charles Frederick Worth, the creator of Haute Couture concept, I would say probably when he died in the late 1800s. His two sons took over the house, and fashion started to change more drastically towards much simpler dresses. And that's where you start to see dresses that are slimmer and less like, you know, a big thing to carry around, and to have to undress, and to have like 5 layers of petticoats and stuff like that. And also Denise Poiret accentuated that very, very much also, because she was very popular back in early 1900s.
If you look at pictures, and I know you have a few that are going around, it's a pretty dramatic change from 1901, let's say, the Edwardian period, to 1921, and women are now wearing men's T-shirts as dresses made out of you know, textiles that were originally for men's underwear. So how did we shift so quickly, and what do you think were sort of the conversations that designers, particularly in the couture industry, were having around women's bodies and shapes and sexuality?
Well, the war, the two world war contributed a lot for women freedom, emancipation. The First World War, it is known as the Great War. It is known as the war that were the most devastating. It is known that every family in Europe knew somebody who died. So it was tremendous amount of men who lost their life, and women had to go to find work, whether during or after war, because there was a big change in the society. So during the war, women went in different factories, so they had to move around, they had to operate machines. So fashion had to adapt to that. Chanel helped a little bit also, because it was what she wanted from the start, to wear pants. And she promoted jersey, which was until then, specialized for male underwear. So go figure where she had her inspiration, right? So she promoted her clothes. A lot of her clothes were made with jersey. And it was a very soft fabric and easy to wear, and not too difficult to go around. And all of this contributed to the big change at the turn of the century.
So some of these things had been in place before. I know one of your pictures is of women dressed in Civil War uniform. Is that correct?
Yeah.
So this had been done before. Men or women had sort of taken on men's clothing in time of war.
Yes.
As early as the Civil War, or did it go back further?
Well, it got back further, but what is known, what is documented once again, this is dresses by Paul Poiret. This is a French woman in the 20s, a big sport woman. There she is again on the right. We have documents that during the Civil War in America, 1860s, there were up to 400 women who were cross-dressed as men and being soldiers during the war. 400. So it's a lot. It's a lot of women who went and all the way up to cross-dressing and fight for the country, fight for the cause. So it is known. We have pictures about that, and we have documents. People talk about them, and it is known.
So, but it was after the Great War, the World War I, that women sort of took on a new role, in large part because you said of the men, not being a lot of men that came home. And also Chanel then, in terms of how she dressed and how she sold her collection. And she also came from the theater, right? She wanted to be a singer, which wasn't a typical thing for a respected woman of her time. But what was changing in Paris at this time? This is sort of the heyday of French haute couture, in the early heyday in 1920s. This is the time of Chanel, Schiaparelli, Madame Grey, so on and so forth. So what was sort of in the air at that time? I mean, obviously, if you look at a Madame Grey dress, it's quite in contrast to what Chanel was doing.
Well, it was an area of prosperity. There were money, people were working, everything was good, everybody has money to spend. It was a good time in Europe in the 20s until the Nazi came up and do what we all know what they did. But it was, in times of prosperity, you get to have all sorts of extravagant people who expresses themselves. And gender, expressing their gender preference, by the way. In Germany, it is known in the 1920s to have had up to 50 lesbian bars in Berlin only. It is unbelievable. We don't have that many bars for lesbian in Paris, Berlin, and New York altogether now. We don't even have that. But in Berlin alone, there was 50 lesbian bars in 1920s. Same in Paris. Same in Paris. It was a time of prosperity, and gays and lesbian were coming up, and it was a thing to celebrate. It was very popular among artists, and they were flamboyant. They wanted to have a good time. They wanted to have fun. So there was a lot of bars in Paris also.
And this was very connected to the single girl or the single man. This was the first time in modern history where you didn't have to be married as a woman to live away from your mother and father, correct?
In the 20s, yes. Women were starting, before that, women were considered older children. Just to give you an example, when you say, can I take your daughter's hand, it means that the father let go of the hand of his daughter and give it to the man that she's going to marry. A woman was never left alone because she was not considered, once again, evolved enough to be on her own. Except in the 20s, women were starting to smoke cigarettes, starting to drink, starting to live alone or live together with other women in apartments outside of their parents, because they wanted to have a life of their own, and they were considering themselves as being individuals. It was a mini revolution, a quiet revolution, but they were doing it.
It's so interesting to me that couture was always so connected to women rather than men. As you said earlier, the men that sort of went to London, Savile Row. Haute Couture, though, was always very much about women. Why do you think that is? And even today, where there's shift again in terms of gender roles and how we dress, there's more parity, obviously. How do you think that's affecting couture and fashion?
Well, if you take the origin of couture, it was to dress women for their court attendance. Either the wedding of so-and-so, and it went on and on and on. When a woman in the court was getting married, she had needs for 15, 20 dresses. So they would be busy with one wedding for a year. As of men, they would wear a tux and that's it. For all the occasions, they had the same uniform all the time, or their uniform, because a lot of the court had soldiers. So it was for men's fashion when haute couture started. Men's fashion was already what we know by now, a suit. As of women was, what we think at that time was at the peak of fashion.
But it wasn't until the 1960s, right, with Le Smoking, Yves Saint Laurent's Le Smoking, that we see what we would, again, perhaps a shift towards men's clothing like we saw in the 20s. Was there anything in between that time? Because the 20s, after World War II, things shifted back to very gendered roles. Was it then Yves Saint Laurent that started to explore and take those apart again?
After the war, what happened is Christian Dior founded his own house, and he created the new look with the big dress and the thin waist and all the look that we know. His business partner was a fabric dealer, so he encouraged Christian Dior, to make very feminine dresses so he can sell more fabric. So that's why after the war, fashion became very, very feminine once again. And it's not until the 70s with Yves Saint Laurent, who started his career as a junior for Christian Dior. Yves Saint Laurent, when he started his house, he created what we know now as the unisex look. And one of his very, very best pieces was the smoking, basically a tuxedo for women. And it became popular and it became standard in women's wear, as well as the Saharian, how do you call the Saharian? The hunting suit.
Oh yes, the safari.
The safari, as well as the safari suit. He popularized the safari suit, which was also very easy to wear in the streets.
But then, sort of ironically, we didn't see that shift again until just recently, and his name is escaping me right now, but he has now an androgynous collection that is both for men and women, and he's now part of the couture season in Paris. And so for the first time ever, there are clothes now going down the runway that are both for men and women in the couture shows in July and January. So that sort of takes us all the way to our current time. So the 20s, the 60s, 70s, and then today, we see again this kind of shift in terms of gender and how we express it through clothing. In terms of your background in haute couture, and then I want to open it up to questions. What do you think, about the kind of conversation that's happening today, and how do you think that's shifting fashion and how we dress and how couture, which is sort of the traditional arm of fashion, how they're perceiving fashion and these changes in society.
It's a little bit difficult to say where couture is going. I think now we experience more diversity and differences between the houses in the haute couture industry. There are houses that are very, very traditional, like Chanel, and there are houses that are very, very forward, like the designer, the couturier that you named. So anything in between. It used never. It was never like that. Haute couture was always very traditional, but exuberant. So it's a little bit hard to say where it's going. I suppose it's cyclic. It goes this way and it comes back a certain amount of years later. It seems like we're in a unisex, non-gender specified area, like we've been knowing in the late 60s with Yves Saint Laurent, and in the 80s with all those pop singers that were androgynous, like Annie Lennox and David Bowie and others that were claiming to be androgynous.
Androgynous, yes. You know, I was just reminded as you were talking about that of you've been doing some costumes. I don't know if you can announce the film that you're working on, but there's a lot of couture techniques that you're using to develop these outfits, and you've also done this for ballet and so on and so forth. Some of these pieces are essentially women's couture pieces for men. How does that change at all when you're dealing with sort of these traditional techniques that were primarily for women's clothes as you're designing men's clothes? I mean, how does that work for you as a designer?
I think, in the women's silhouette, in the women's body, you can have all sorts of things now. You can have from a size 2 to a size, I don't know what. So it's just a question of applying the technique of building a piece of clothing for that specific body. Now, if it's a man or a woman, I think it doesn't really matter as long as you give it the same kind of treatment, as long as you give it the same mind. If you want somebody to look more attractive or more sexy or more, depending on what you want to give them, it's the same technique that applies.
So I want to open it up to questions. So if anyone has questions, okay, 1 and then 2.
So with all like the popularity with fast fashion right now, do you think that couture is kind of dying right now?
You know, we've been. That's a very good question. Thank you. We've been saying that since the very first day that I was aware of haute couture. Probably you were not born. But we always say haute couture is dying, haute couture is dying. Yes, it is dying, but it's reviving the second after. It's evolving. It's evolving because somebody puts attention to it and somebody make it work. Haute couture is now, it's not the same as 10 years ago. It's not the same years as 20 years ago. It's not the same thing as it's ever been. Is it better? Is it worse? I cannot answer that. It's just different. Because you have to understand that haute couture is extremely expensive to operate. You have to have a lot of employees. You have to have a lot of cash because you have to buy extremely expensive fabric and all sorts of embroidery and stuff like that. It costs a lot of money. So you have to have a good deal of clients that are going to buy when you're finished. So basically what holds haute couture there is their client. So no matter if they're small or a big group, it's what holds haute couture. When I was working back in the 1990s in Paris, and 200, and the year 2000, we used to say, there's only 17 clients for haute couture left in the world. But now it's different. Those clients were Princess of Arabia, who would fly to Paris, and she would buy dresses, and the husband would buy cars. And that's what the clients were back then. Now the clients are different. It's not the same, obviously, because they buy different designers that were not there at that time, and those designers would probably not please the same clients. So the client is different, and that's why haute couture survive. It's because of their clients, basically.
On a related question, do you think that haute couture is now influenced by fast fashion? It used to be that haute couture was really the influencer for all other forms.
Yes, it used to be like haute couture. Everybody would go to haute couture fashion show. They would sketch, and after they would make it very, very, very affordable versions of it, and you would find them in Macy's. This is before the 1950s. I would say fashion. I would say the street fashion is influenced by haute couture, and it's probably started with Jean-Paul Gaultier when he first arrived in haute couture field. Gaultier is the son of the streetwear. Basically, he made his living out of streetwear that he adapted for his collections, and he did exactly the same for his haute couture collection. He takes a dress and he puts like a trellis pattern on it, and it's a $100,000 dress. So it comes from the street. It comes from somewhere that is not in the highest realm of, design.
I'm just curious as to what your design process is versus when you do made to measure and then your private line. I know you said you don't really like to sketch, but does it start with draping and then you communicate with your client or your team? Just the process.
I think the ready-to-wear is more driven by a more abstract clients. I have an idea of who could buy those pieces of clothing and who I would like to see buying those pieces of clothing. As of the made-to-measure, I have specific clients, so I know who I work for and with. Most of the time with my clients of made-to-measure, we build the clothes together. She tells me what she wants, what she doesn't want, what she likes, what she doesn't like, and from there we build the piece together. As of the ready-to-wear, the client is not there. I don't know. I can only expect her to be, but it's more difficult.
At this point, you're not even doing ready-to-wear. Why did you get out of ready-to-wear?
Why do I get out of? It's a question of economy. It's a question of economy. The recession was there, and Saks Fifth Avenue told me, whether we buy that collection or not, if we buy it and if it doesn't sell, we're not going to buy you anymore. Or you could skip a season and come back next season. I said, I'm going to skip. I don't want a chance. So I skipped a season. The next season I came back to Saks and I asked them to see my collection, or if they were interested in coming to see some prototype that I was starting. The buyers have changed. It was very young and experienced person, and she says, your clothes doesn't fit in our philosophy anymore. And I'm like, so I turned around and I made bridal.
Yes, in the back.
So knowing what you know now, is there any advice you would give your former younger, fresh, just starting out designer self?
Oh my. There's many things that I would have told myself or I would have advised myself. Probably get experience, once again, as I said before. Because everything that you do when you're on your own is something that you're going to pay for, whether it's success, that is going to bring its share of income, or mistake, which you're going to pay for without the income. So, if you have experience of what you're supposed to do, you're going to be able to predict a little bit more the traps and the mistakes. There's always traps and mistakes. You always get to hear about that designer, that company is filing for bankruptcy and this and that. There's always. It's, we make mistakes as much as we have successes. But the more you experience, the more chances you have to succeed, basically.
Gilles, I know you'll give an honest answer, so I'm going to ask this. But what is your honest view of what's happening in fashion today? And I mean, what are your feelings about fashion and sort of what it means as compared to, as you mentioned, the heydays in the 90s?
Well, what I can see with my very own little humble observation is that the market of fashion is quite saturated. I don't know if there's another room for another major designer that succeeds and calls it like a Marc Jacob level international. I don't know if anybody else can come on the scene and succeed as much. Probably, there's still probably room, but you know, it's probably getting very, very tight. So the possibilities that young designers have now is to work within their own surrounding, within their own friends and family, and count them as clients and cater to them. It's what we're going back to the turn of the century, 19th century, where there were a lot of seamstresses everywhere. And it's a very good thing because you can cater to a clientele that you know better than if you sell to Saks Fifth Avenue and God knows where you don't know the client. I can only imagine being a big international brand and every single season having to come up with a collection that you don't know who's going to buy. I cannot imagine that pressure. It's unbelievable. Who's going to be? What if I designed that? Who's going to buy it? Is there anybody who's going to buy it? I think it's enormous amount of pressure. So I think designers that are upcoming are having a much better and secure future, if you want to see it like that, because they're going to cater to somebody who they know, or at least have access to their clients much more easier than bigger companies.
And to be clear, in couture, you knew who your clients were as you were developing these collections.
Couture, you know your clients. It's always the same client that come from one season to the other. Very, very limited. Very, very little are not coming back, and very, very little are new clients from one season to the other. So you can always get to know them better and anticipate their taste and anticipate what they want to wear. You can always, Haute Couture, as I told before, it's a very, very expensive collection to produce. So you can always produce a collection that is going to please the press, but present something else to your client, or have a mix of both, present to your clients that is more affordable, or there is more their taste. That possibility also exists.
Since we have a lot of students, and then I'll get to your question, is what's the thing, because you work sort of behind the scenes for a lot of different designers. You don't have to name names, but what's the thing that drives you nuts about working for these companies? What do you wish that they knew better, that they were trained better in? And these are some very big designers out there.
Okay, I'm not going to name anybody. It could be everybody also. It could be anybody. It could be nobody. Since I'm trained technically as well as for design, I'm expecting my clients to understand that, at least to be at the same level as me. And when my designer clients, ask me to do things and they don't know that level of technicality, or it is a bore. It is a bore because we don't speak the same language. And sometimes I do things they don't understand, so they think it's a mistake, so it comes back to me as of they're the one who don't understand what I did. So it's always a little bit like a give and take, a chance, whether they're going to be competent, whether they're not going to be competent, whether they're trained or not. Can
you give us an example?
Yes, there was a designer once. He wanted to fit the dress, and he just took the dress and go like, okay, put pins there. And I'm like, really? Where? Where am I supposed to put pins? You know? And for them, it was the logical thing to say the dress was fitted, with just by pulling the dress like that. And I'm like, so I put pins in it, and I'm like, the fit model went into her changing room. I took all the pins off, and I fitted the way that I know how to fit a dress, and that was it. But I just am very uncomfortable when that kind of thing happened.
Interesting.
You understand why, right?
All right, we had a question in the middle. You had a question, yes?
Is it profitable and exciting to design for the Metropolitan Opera House or France or any of the major
I did not design for Opera House. I work in their workshop when I was in training in Paris. Profitable, yes, it is profitable because you're an internationally known designer who caters to costume designing. So you're called by the opera to design their next production for so-and-so artist, singer, and this and that. So it is profitable, yes.
Probably what a lot of people don't know is that costumes are still done in the traditional methods.
Oh my God, the costumes, especially in the Opera of Paris, the costumes are the equivalent of haute couture. It is made with exactly the same technique. It is super, super expensive to put up a piece, a dress in opera if you want it to last a whole season, if not many, many, many seasons after. It has to be extremely well made, so it sustains the time and it sustains different body who's going to wear it, because the same production is not necessarily made with the same artists. It is extremely well made.
I had a question over. Yes.
In about like 5 years or so, how much power do you see clothing having on sexuality, specifically with men? Because women have a little bit more freedom right now, men don't get that much freedom. So where do you see that?
Good question. There were many attempts at that that has been made by different designers. Of course, it's never mainstream because for many reasons. You have to understand that if you do that, if you sexualize your men's collection, you have to understand who's going to wear it. It's probably mostly gay guys. Probably mostly they're going to buy some of them to go to clubs. They're not going to wear that in the streets, and certainly not straight guys. So you cater to a very, very, very small audience. So you have to understand that if you do that, that's what's going to happen in terms of sales, because there's no secret here, right? Fashion is a business. If you put up a fashion collection, it's because it's the business that you want to get into. You have to make money with it. There's no secret, right? There's nobody that just put up a collection and just for fun or just for designing. No, you have to pay the rent, right? So if you do that kind of design, which has many attempts, when I tell you again, you have to understand who's going to buy it and at what percentage of income it's going to represent.
Yes, in the middle.
You're really stupid asking this question, you can ask it. What exactly does the word haute couture mean? And what is it? And another question, number 2 question, is you said something in France, it's a trademark haute couture.
Yeah.
What does that mean exactly? And also, you're in that industry, that high-end industry, people are very picky, right? So why do you want to have such a clientele that are very picky? And they're very demanding, right? So how do you deal with such a clientele? How do you deal with a customer that's very picky?
Okay, that's very interesting. Haute couture was created by an Englishman who came to Paris. He worked in a department store. There was no ready-to-made clothes. Imagine a world where there's no store, clothes for store. Imagine that. It's hard to imagine, but that's how it was back in 1850s, 1860s. So he worked in the department store and he sold fabric where the fabric would be turned into piece of clothing by the seamstress. What happened most of the time is the client would come to the store with the seamstress and they would decide of which fabric would be better for that dress, what quantity and this and that, and they would go and the seamstress would make the dress. He decided, Charles Frederick Worth decided that he would do that for his own, but for a very wealthy clientele. And he targeted all the courts, mainly in France. But when he got successful, all the other courts of all the other countries came to see him. So it's a totally made-up thing that he put up there. And it's a very, very haute couture means high sewing or high way of making clothing. It's a very, very luxurious way of making clothing. So he introduced he introduced hand embroidery, hand lace making. Everything had to be dyed according to the main color of the fabric. If there were like lace trimming, it had to be dyed according to the color of the fabric. The different fabrics had to be treated to be sewn together. It was very, very time consuming and work demanding. And it was made to measure for their very wealthy client. What was your second question again?
It's about picky clients and why would you want to
Picky clients.
work with demanding clients?
Well, it exists, and yes and no. And most of the time, when it comes to meeting the clients, the designer doesn't do that. The couturier doesn't meet the clients. It's very, very rare. He's probably going to greet them when the clients comes in the house. But as soon as it is time to go for their fitting or anything, he disappears, and it's the chief of the workshop who's going to take it over. The clients are picky, yes and no. And the client, in this case, always is right, because if she drops money, you survive, and if she doesn't, you close. So, you know.
But Gilles, there's also a woman who buys haute couture knows much more about clothes than an average person.
Also, the clients
so
are
they're speaking
educated.
a language that is much higher than an average client.
Yeah. We did dress at Maison Lacroix, and the original dress was a strapless right across like that, a little bit like an 18th century corset that was embroidered and this and that. We reproduced that dress, because when you do a dress, they give you the reproduction to do for the clients, since you put it up and you know all the secrets and stuff like that. So we did that dress again for a client, and we had to raise the neckline, we had to put sleeves, we had to make it a little bit different. It's okay. It's okay. The first style was done. The designer is happy. It went into many press magazines and Vogue and this and that. The designer was very happy. Now, if it's the client wants changes in color, in the style, you just say yes. That's fine. You're a business after all.
And to clarify, haute couture is the idea that you have a collection of a certain amount of dresses, and then the customer chooses which look they like, and then it's customized for that client. Ready to wear, on the other hand, is mass-made clothes that you walk into a store and take off the rack. So those are the two different.
And when the client come to a haute couture house, she's seen the collection, or if she did not see the whole collection, she is presented with the rest of the collection on live models in the house. And she gets to see all the styles that she wants to see on a live person, and she gets to choose what she wants to be ordered and order it. So she knows what she's getting, and if she wants to make changes for religious purpose or for the attendant that she has to attend, for the event that she attends, she tells the salesperson, is that possible to put pockets? Is that possible to raise the neckline and blah, blah, blah. So they discuss that, the salesperson is aware, and it's going to be communicated to the chief of workshops, and that's how it is.
One more question. Let's see, I'm going to go with you since you haven't asked yet.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about design for costumes, films, or TV show. How is the timeline different from designing, say, according to the fashion week cycle and schedule, and whether you have as much or more restricted creative freedom, and how you work with people producing the show?
Okay. Of course, you have deadlines, of course, and you have budget to respect. And depending on the production, you're either very lucky because you have a very good budget, or very bad lucky because you have a very tight budget. The deadline depends on the production. Most of the time, you have to put up a team that's going to work on it, and everybody is going to be aware of the deadlines and are going to work with it, and the deadlines as well as the budget. So you can have money to make a dress, or you can be tight and you'll have to rent half of your costumes and make the other half because you cannot find it, or they're so specific you have to have something, you have to have them, you know. So it depends on how everything that's, you know, all the perimeters. If you have money or if you have time, then, you know.
So Gilles, last question. If you could wave a magic wand, where would you like to see fashion head in the next few years?
Well, I think it's not taking a turn where it's as creative as it was and as it should or could be. So I would like designers and also clients to be a little bit more daring. Fashion is nice. It's a pleasure to dress up in the morning. It's a pleasure to open your closet and say, what am I going to wear? Or depress about that you don't have anything to wear, then you go shopping, you know. But it's a pleasure to dress, and I find it a little bit disappointing to see collections that are uninteresting, as when you're a designer, you're there to put up your own voice in the garments and making something that is, you know, different than the others. So that's what I'm expecting. That's what I would like even more present in the collections. But for some reason, from one time to the other, from one season to the other, designers are more creative or more cautious. Of course, economy is always very directly involved in the collection, because clients will decide if they have money to spend or if they're going to pass on that extra dress that normally would have they would have acquired. So, you know, it's a very complex situation, but I would like the collections definitely to be more exuberant and creative.
Thank you so much for coming today. We appreciate your perspective. So next week, Daniel Friedman will be speaking. Here's the caveat. I don't know which room we're going to be in because they keep moving us around. But after next week, which is October 2nd, we will be back into the Katie Murphy for the rest of the semester. It is renovated. So I will be sending out an email, so just please make sure you check your mail before you come to class next week so you know where you're going. So we'll see you next week.